Hello friends, welcome to my channel. I am the creator of Transulano. I have made this video especially for you. I hope you will support me. Now I will watch this video with you.
The kettle had just begun to scream when the lock turned, and for one suspended second I thought only about the rain blowing in from the hallway and the soup cooling on the stove. Then he stepped across the threshold in a belted charcoal coat, his hair brushed into a shape I had never seen on his head, a faint trace of powder catching the yellow light above the sink, and I realized the smell that came in with him was not just wet wool and November air but department store perfume. Soft and expensive and completely wrong for the man who used to buy the same unscented soap in bulk. He didn't say my name. He stood there with one hand still on the knob, wedding ring flashing, eyes so frightened I understood at once that this had not started tonight. So why had I been finding crumbs of another life all over our apartment for weeks and calling it stress, carelessness, anything but what it was? He looked unfamiliar and heartbreakingly known at the same time. And to explain why I set a second mug on the table instead of asking him to leave, I have to go much further back. Before all of that, before the coat and the perfume and the quiet look on his face that made the room feel smaller, my life was arranged in straight lines. I don't mean that poetically. I mean I labeled pantry jars with a little embossing machine I bought on sale and found deeply satisfying. Pasta. Rice. Lentils. Tea. I folded towels the same way every Sunday and stacked them by color, not because anybody cared, but because it made the week feel less likely to slide off its hinges. My idea of recklessness, at 29, was buying the expensive olive oil without waiting for a coupon. We lived above a bakery that started filling the stairwell with yeast and sugar by 4:30 every morning. In winter, the windows sweated. In summer, the old radiator hissed anyway because the building had the temperament of a Victorian ant. I liked knowing the sounds. The rattle of the delivery van. The boy downstairs dragging flour sacks in by the back entrance. The exact minute the church bells 2 blocks over landed on the hour, always a little late, as if time itself had trouble climbing the hill. My husband, Evan, fit into that life so neatly I mistook the fit for proof. He remembered to pay the gas bill before I did. He mended buttons instead of throwing shirts away. He carried, of all things, a silver thimble in the little leather pouch where most men would keep guitar picks or spare change, because his grandmother had taught him to sew and he swore it was more useful than 9/10 of what people called masculine pride. If a sleeve hem came loose, if a cushion split at the seam, if my coat lining started to bunch, Evan fixed it with the concentration of a jeweler. That was one of the first things I loved about him, the steadiness of his hands. The second was his kindness, which came quietly and without audience. He mailed birthday cards to relatives I forgot about. He knew which cashier at the grocery store had a husband in chemo and asked after him without making it sound like charity. He brought home bruised flowers from the discount bucket and arranged them better than the florist did. He also hated conflict with a level of commitment I once thought was sweet and later understood as dangerous. Evan could evade a difficult conversation so gently you almost thanked him for it. If something bothered him, he polished it into silence. If he needed something, he learned to live without asking. He had a way of smoothing the edge of a napkin with his thumb when he was anxious, pressing it flat and flatter, as if enough care could remove all creases from the world. My mother admired him in principle and distrusted him in practice, which was how she approached almost everyone. Too agreeable, she said once, unwrapping one of the lemon candies she carried loose in her coat pockets, each one mysteriously covered in lint and maternal authority. My mother believed in sharp corners. She had raised me on sayings she delivered like invoices. Steady hands make a steady life. Don't build your home on weather. If you don't name what matters, someone else will name it for you. She had spent most of my childhood making order out of my father's drifting forgetfulness, and it left her with the permanent expression of a woman who has just spotted a spill before anyone else. I loved her. I also spent half my adulthood trying not to become her and the other half succeeding in ways that would have pleased her enormously. The first crack was so small I nearly stepped over it. I was sorting laundry on a Tuesday, standing in the bedroom with one sock in my hand and the radio muttering through static, when a pale receipt fell out of Evan's coat pocket and landed face up on the floor. Marigold Studio, it said in gold script, which sounded less like a place that repaired men's shoes and more like a place where women emerged with softened faces and glossy bags. I picked it up because I thought maybe it belonged to a client. Evan worked in office administration for a property firm and was forever carrying other people's papers home by accident. But the line items sat there under the date like they had been waiting for me. Brow shaping. Color consultation. Cash paid. I read it once, then again, the way you reread a text message hoping the words will rearrange into something less absurd. Brow shaping could mean anything, I told myself. Grooming. Some kind of package. Maybe Marigold Studio did barbering and had an unfortunate name. Maybe color consultation was for ties. Maybe I had married a man who'd finally discovered seasonal palettes and I was about to learn there were 12 kinds of winter. The explanations lined up eagerly because I wanted them to. When Evan came home, rain-speckled and apologizing for being late, I had already placed the receipt back in his pocket and hated myself for the care with which I did it. We ate lentil soup. He told me about a copier malfunction. I told him the woman downstairs had started feeding the stray tabby again, which meant the cat had now effectively unionized us into caring for it. He laughed in the right place. I laughed too. My chest felt full of thumbtacks. I might have asked him that night if my life had been built on something I had mistaken for stone. I might have held up the receipt and watched whatever needed watching happen in the kitchen under the weak yellow light. Instead, I heard my mother's voice, absurdly clear, "Don't begin a conversation unless you're willing to hear the answer." And the truth was, I wasn't. That was the first time I noticed myself choosing ignorance like a locked door. After that, the apartment changed its shape around me. Not literally. The radiator still hissed. The bakery still smelled like cinnamon at dawn. But every ordinary thing had a second edge. Evan started coming home a little later on Thursdays. He said there were new software problems at work. He said a supervisor was leaning on him. He said the bus had been slow. None of the explanations were impossible. That was the worst part. Nothing was theatrical enough to justify the panic I kept folding and unfolding in private. Then there was the voice message. He had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he took the trash down, and it lit up with an incoming voicemail transcription before the screen dimmed again. I saw only the first line because I should not have been looking, and yet, there I was, looking. "Hi, Evan, just checking in after today. You were very brave." My throat went dry so fast it felt like my body had decided on fear before my mind could name it. I told myself brave could mean anything. Brave could be a dentist. Brave could be a biopsy. Brave could be a confrontation at work. Brave could be an affair, which my mind reached for with a weird kind of relief because at least adultery belonged to an old familiar category with instructions attached. You cry. You rage. You call a lawyer. There were brochures for that life. There were television episodes. There were friends who knew what to say. But something in me already knew I was standing much farther from the map than that. I didn't play the voicemail. I didn't touch the phone. I stood at the counter with my palm flat on the cold laminate until he came back upstairs smelling of damp cardboard and alley rain and said, "Did I miss anything?" I answered too quickly. No. That was the second lie. I had always believed dishonesty announced itself with a certain posture. Shifted eyes. Stammering. Guilt bright as a flare. But lying, I learned, can sound exactly like your normal voice if your fear is strong enough. At work the next day I overfilled a spreadsheet 3 times because I could not stop thinking about the word brave. My friend Danny found me staring at my computer like it had insulted my ancestors and dropped into the chair beside my desk with her lunch in one hand and a chipped travel mug in the other. Danny wore green nail polish that was always half gone because she was forever picking at it while thinking. She had a face that registered contempt beautifully and compassion against its will. We had met 3 years earlier when the office printer jammed and she fixed it by kicking the tray with surprising precision. "You look," she said, unwrapping a sandwich, "like somebody asked you to bury a body in business casual." I should have said I was tired. I should have said month-end reporting was killing me. Instead, I heard myself say, "What do people buy at a place called Marigold Studio?" Danny took a bite, considered, and said, "Depends." Flowers? Regret? Probably brows. I laughed. Just once. It felt almost painful. Then I told her a version of the truth, so edited it could have run for office. I said I'd found a receipt in Evan's coat pocket. I said there had been a strange voicemail. I said I thought maybe he was hiding something and I did not know which possibility frightened me more, that he had done something terrible or that he had done something I didn't even have a category for. Danny went still in that attentive way some people do when they realize the joke has ended. "Okay," she said. "First, breathe like you're a mammal. Second, not knowing is making this bigger than it may be." "That's comforting," I said. It wasn't supposed to be comforting. It was supposed to be useful. She peeled at her nail polish. "And for the record, something I don't have a category for is where most real-life lives." Danny had this infuriating habit of stumbling into wisdom while looking like she was late for a garage band rehearsal. She had once stayed in a terrible relationship 6 months too long because she believed people deserved second chances and threes. That was her flaw, that generosity tipped so far it sometimes became negligence. But if you were in trouble, she was the one who showed up with soup, batteries, and exactly one good question. "What good question?" I muttered. She looked at me. "Are you more afraid of being lied to, or of having to rearrange how you see someone?" I hated her for that for a full minute. I did not ask Evan that night either. I watched him chop onions in our kitchen with the same careful hands that had hemmed my winter coat and signed birthday cards and rubbed circles into my back the year I stopped sleeping properly after a miscarriage nobody but a handful of people knew about. Grief had entered our marriage once before and left us gentler for a while, quieter for longer. We had survived that by becoming extremely efficient. Appointments. Recovery days. Meals portioned into freezer containers. The doctor had called it good coping. Maybe it was. Maybe it was also how we learned that pain could be managed if you filed it under practical tasks quickly enough. Now I watched him scrape onions into a pan and wondered whether efficiency was about to fail me for the first time. Signs accumulated the way dust does, slowly until sunlight makes it undeniable. A soft scarf I didn't recognize, tucked too far into the hall closet to be accidental. A pharmacy bag with concealer and micellar water among the vitamins. A button-down shirt of his that came back from the cleaners missing, and in its place a garment bag he snatched from my hands with such polite speed that it was more revealing than if he had shouted. He started moisturizing, which I know sounds ridiculous except that when you have built a life on someone's habits, even the skin of their face can feel like a plot twist. And still I said nothing. Silence changes the body. My jaw ached. I woke in the night with my teeth clenched so hard the pressure ran into my temples. I found myself pausing outside the bathroom when Evan was inside, listening to the cabinet doors open and close. I became a woman who noted timestamps and expenditures and the exact cent on her husband's collar when she bent to pick his coat off the chair. There is no pretty way to confess that. Suspicion is ugly work. Even when it leads you toward truth, it stains your hands on the way. My mother, naturally, chose that month to become more present. She had a radar for instability the way some birds sense weather. She called twice as often. She appeared with soup nobody had requested. She looked around our apartment like an inspector assessing a bridge. At Sunday dinner she handed me a plastic container of stewed apples and said, not quietly enough, "Evan, you're getting thinner." He smiled. "I'm fine, Celia." She said, and unwrapped a lemon candy. "You always say that right before someone ends up taking care of you." There were people in the world who could hear concern in my mother's voice. I heard control dressed for church. Evan smoothed his napkin edge with his thumb. I appreciate the warning. Later, when I was scraping plates into the sink, my mother came up beside me and lowered her voice. "Is everything all right?" The answer caught in my throat because it was impossible to explain how badly I wanted her to be wrong about the existence of a problem and how badly I did not want her anywhere near it if she was right. "We're just tired," I said. She nodded the way people nod when they have decided you are lying but are gracious enough not to embarrass you with proof. "Steady hands," she murmured, tapping the counter. "That's all I'm saying." I almost laughed. If she knew how unstable my hands felt, she would have confiscated my whole life and reorganized it alphabetically. The thing about living beside an unspoken truth is that you start performing your own normality with the same effort the other person is spending on theirs. I asked about his day. He asked about mine. We took out the trash. We paid bills. We watched a detective show in which everyone was hiding something and every secret was solved in 43 minutes plus commercials. In bed, he curled toward the edge while I stared at the ceiling and thought about the bravery voicemail until the word lost all meaning. And then, because life likes to pry secrets loose with the least dignified tools available, the ceiling leaked. It was a hard, dirty rain, the kind that turns gutters vindictive. I came home to find a brown stain spreading across the plaster above the hall closet, dripping onto the umbrella stand. The superintendent was unreachable. I hauled towels and a bucket out while muttering to myself, which is how I handle emergencies when nobody is around to impress. Our hall closet was a narrow vertical graveyard of seasonal things, boots, scarves, spare blankets, a box of Christmas lights that worked only out of spite, so I started pulling everything out to keep it dry. At the bottom, shoved behind an old hat box I had not opened in years, was a canvas tote bag I didn't recognize. I knew before I touched it that I should stop. I touched it anyway. Inside was a folded cardigan in soft gray knit, a small cosmetics case, 2 receipts from Marigold Studio, and a notebook with a navy cover worn white at the corners. Not a diary with a lock. Not the theatrical object of a person begging to be caught. It looked like something bought in an office supply aisle and then handled until it became intimate. I sat down on the hallway floor with rain ticking into the bucket beside me and opened it. If I tell you I felt guilty, that's true. If I tell you I felt entitled, that's also true. Both can live in the same body and glare at each other. The first page wasn't dated. It began halfway down, as if whatever came before had been torn out or never written. I keep thinking if I can make myself small enough inside the role, the feeling will pass. I read that line 4 times. The hallway smelled like wet plaster and dust. My fingers left faint damp marks on the paper. The entries were irregular. Weeks apart sometimes, days apart others. Not a record of events so much as pressure escaping through language. At 14 he had borrowed his cousin's cardigan while house-sitting and stood in the kitchen terrified by the rightness of it. At 19 he had thrown away a blouse he bought in another town because he could not bear seeing it in his dorm room. At 26, newly married to me, he had written, "She deserves a whole person," and I keep offering edited pages. At 31, only 3 months before I found the notebook, there was a line that made me put the journal down and press my fist to my mouth. I love my wife. I am also disappearing inside what she thinks I am preserving. The rain kept ticking. Somewhere downstairs, the bakery mixer roared on as if nothing in the world had tilted. There were names in the notebook, too. Dr. Larkin. Mara. A support group on Thursdays. A line underlined twice, not broken. Not late. Not selfish to tell the truth. There was 1 page written as a letter to me and never given. I don't know whether this means I am your husband, your wife, both, neither, or a person in between the words we keep on the shelf because they are easier than looking directly at one another. I only know I am running out of ways to be loved without being seen, and that is beginning to feel like its own kind of lie. I did what many practical women do when their interior life catches fire. I cleaned. I moved every wet item out of the closet. I put down fresh towels. I called the superintendent again. I made a list for repairs. Then I sat on the sofa with the notebook beside me and waited for Evan to come home, not because I was ready, but because readiness had left the building without giving notice. Only he didn't come home on time. He texted at 6:12. Running late. Don't wait for dinner. My eyes went to the notebook on the coffee table. Running late for what? There is a kind of anger that feels hot and righteous, and there is another kind that arrives cold, with a horrible sense of efficiency. I knew, in that hour before he came back, that I had crossed into the second kind. I found Mara's number in my phone and stared at it. Mara was Evan's older sister, a pediatric nurse with a laugh that arrived 3 seconds after the joke and a habit of carrying the same cobalt blue travel mug everywhere, as if hydration were a moral duty. She was impossible not to like and mildly impossible to pin down. If conflict was approaching, Mara had a genius for stepping to the side and offering snacks. But she loved Evan with the kind of loyalty that notices what a family has spent years refusing to articulate. I called her anyway. When she answered, I could hear hospital beeps in the background and the rustle of fabric. If this is about Uncle Ray's birthday, she said, I already bought a card and yes, it is better than yours. Mara. She went quiet at once. What happened? I looked at the notebook. I found something. That was all I had to say. She exhaled so softly I almost missed it. Do you want me to come? There it was, my first answer to a question I hadn't been brave enough to form. Somebody else knew enough to understand the shape of the emergency. No, I said, because what I really wanted was impossible. I wanted the last 6 weeks undone. I wanted not to be the woman sitting 3 feet from her husband's hidden life. I just need to know if I'm about to confront something I can't even describe. Mara made a sound halfway between a sigh and a wince. I don't know what he's told you. Nothing, I said. It came out sharper than I intended. That's the problem. A pause. Then, very gently, he's been trying to tell you for a long time. I laughed once, ugly and brief. That is a generous definition of trying. You're right. Her voice changed, that nurse voice entered, the one built to withstand panic without flattening it. Listen to me. He should have told you. Earlier. Clearly. You have every right to be hurt. But if you are asking whether this is about someone else, no. It isn't. My entire body seemed to notice the floor at once. I sat down because I was already sitting and somehow still needed to. Then what is it about? Mara didn't rush. That was one thing she did well. She let hard truths arrive at walking speed. About him, she said. About who he's been trying not to be since he was a kid. About him finally not being able to do that anymore. I closed my eyes. The apartment felt too warm. Did you know? I knew something. Not all of it. He didn't have language for it when we were younger. Neither did I. Once, when we were kids, he cried because my mother made him take off a pair of my tights he'd hidden under his jeans. I was 12, he was 9, and all I understood was shame had already found him early. She stopped. I should have said more. I thought I was protecting him by waiting for him to choose the time. And instead, he learned everybody would wait forever if he kept saying he was fine. That line lodged in me because it was so close to the marriage I recognized. Not just in him. In us. After I hung up, I put the notebook back into the tote bag, then took it out again. Put it back. Took it out. I laughed at myself because apparently the collapse of my life still had room for repetitive nonsense. The cat downstairs yowled in the alley. The bucket in the hall overflowed a little. The radiator clanged. The world kept doing its cheap practical tricks. I wish I could say I became instantly wise after reading that journal. I did not. Wisdom takes longer than shock. That evening I cycled through anger, pity, grief, curiosity, resentment, and the most childish thought of all, which was simply, why was I the last to know? It embarrassed me, even then. Not because it was false, but because it was so small beside what he had clearly been carrying. Yet marriage makes selfishness look principled if you phrase it as injury. I had been injured. I had also, I would later understand, centered myself so quickly that I almost missed the full human being standing at the edge of his own terror. There was one more thing in the tote bag, folded into the back pocket. A store receipt for a pair of low black boots, a lipstick in a shade called Cedar Rose, and a train ticket dated that same afternoon. Not to another city. Just across town. To a neighborhood where there were no offices of his company, no friends we shared, no believable errand at all. I held the flimsy paper between my fingers and thought, so this is what secrecy looks like up close. Not glamorous. Not cinematic. Receipts. Transit cards. Moisture-soft notebook pages. A person taking the train toward themselves because they cannot survive the bus ride home inside the old costume one more day. He didn't come in until after 8. By then the rain had thickened, and the kitchen window had turned into black glass. I had made soup, then let it cool. Heated water, then forgotten it. When I heard the key scrape in the lock, every thought I had rehearsed fled the room and left me with sensation. The smell of rain. The click of the latch. The kettle beginning again because I had absent-mindedly turned it on for the 3rd time. Then he stepped through the door, and you already know how that looked at first. What I didn't understand until much later was that he had dressed with extraordinary modesty for what must have felt, to him, like walking into a court without counsel. There was nothing exaggerated in it. The coat was charcoal wool, belted not to dramatize a waist, but because it fit that way. Underneath I could see the edge of a cream blouse at the throat. His brows had been shaped, yes, and there was a trace of makeup, but the face I knew was still there, only less hidden from itself. His hair, always a little too short for softness, had been brushed forward and around in a way that made his eyes look larger. One small pearl stud caught the light at one ear. His hands trembled around a wet paper shopping bag. I had placed the notebook on the kitchen table. His gaze landed on it and stopped. Not because he hadn't expected discovery eventually. Because this was clearly not how he had wanted it. For a second we only listened to the kettle. It screamed between us like an alarm neither of us had earned the right to resent. He set the shopping bag down with ridiculous care. "I'm sorry," he said. I remember being offended by the plainness of that. Sorry? As if he had dented the car. As if apology were sized correctly for the thing in the room. "Are you," I asked, "sorry that I found it or sorry that you hid it?" His face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to see the answer was both. He shut the door behind him. Water ran off the hem of his coat onto the floorboards. Both. It would be satisfying to tell you I spoke with grace. I did not. I was too raw for grace and too controlled for chaos, which is its own unpleasant combination. How long? He swallowed. A long time. That's not a length. No, he looked down at his hands. Years. The trying not to. The appointments, a few months. The journal, longer. I reached for the kettle almost violently, turned it off, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. Were you ever going to tell me? Yes. When? I kept choosing later. He gave a tiny, bleak laugh. It turns out later is not a real date. That was such an even answer that I nearly hated him for remaining himself in the middle of becoming unrecognizable to me. I sat down because my knees had begun to feel unreliable. He stayed standing until I said, "Sit. Please. I can't have this conversation with you hovering in the doorway like a witness." He sat opposite me at the small kitchen table where we had paid bills, mourned my grandmother, eaten takeout after long days, argued gently about whether tomatoes belonged in the fridge. The pearl stud trembled when he moved. I noticed, absurdly, that the shade of lipstick on his mouth matched the receipt in my memory. Cedar Rose. A name no one had ever needed until that moment. "I found the journal because the closet leaked," I said. He blinked once. Of course it did. That was almost funny. Some part of me appreciated the pettiness of the universe. Another part wanted to throw the sugar bowl. "Mara knew," I said. He nodded. "Some of it. My mother suspects something." A muscle moved in his cheek. "That sounds like Celia." This, too, nearly made me laugh, and the feeling of nearly laughing while your marriage is splitting open is one of the strangest sensations I know. Human beings are inappropriate in all directions. He folded his hands together. The wedding ring gleamed. I don't know how to start this in a way that doesn't hurt you. That sentence finally did something to me. Not because it was elegant. Because it was true. I said, try the part you wrote and didn't give me. His eyes flicked to the journal. He understood at once what I meant. Color rose under the powder at his cheekbones. You read that. I read enough. I did not say all, though I had read nearly all. Shame sat between us like a third person. I know that was yours. I know I should have stopped. I also know you left me no honest path to the truth. You're right. I had expected defensiveness, some attempt to reclaim moral ground. His immediate agreement made me feel less triumphant than stranded. He pressed his thumbnail into the pad of his other thumb, a nervous habit I had never seen and instantly understood was one of the private ones. I have spent most of my life trying to be the kind of man nobody would question. Useful. Calm. Forgettable in the right ways. I thought if I did it well enough, whatever this was would either go away or become so small I could carry it without anyone noticing. And for a while, I told myself I was managing. Managing what? He looked at me fully then, and I saw the terror in it, yes, but also a terrible relief. The fact that I am not the man you think you married. Or not only that. I don't have all the right words yet. Some days I think woman fits. Some days I think I have spent so long translating myself for other people that even that word feels like borrowed clothing. I know I have felt more myself in the moments I stopped forcing masculinity onto every gesture. I know that hiding it has been making me smaller and crueler through omission. I know I love you. I know that part is real. The kitchen went very still. Somewhere downstairs, a tray clattered. A laugh rose from the street and vanished. I said the worst thing I said in the whole story then. I have replayed it enough to know the exact shape of it. Then who have I been married to? It landed the moment it left my mouth. Not because it was a dishonest question, but because it stripped him down to a fraud and erased every real kindness we had lived inside together. I watched it strike. He lowered his eyes and nodded once as if accepting a blow he had expected. To me, he said quietly, you have been married to someone who loved you and lied by leaving pieces out. I wish I had apologized immediately. I didn't. I was still too busy defending the ruins inside my own chest. How was I supposed to see this? I asked. Was I just not looking? Was I stupid? Did everyone else know but me? No, he leaned forward, hands open now, coat forgotten, rainwater drying on the floor beside him. No. You weren't stupid. I worked very hard not to be seen. That's not on you. It feels like it's on me. I know. His voice thinned. And some of this is on me. A lot of it. I let you think I was only stressed. I lied about where I was. I used money from our account without telling you. I kept waiting to become certain before I hurt you, and all that did was guarantee you'd be hurt and confused. That was the first moment accountability entered the room, and it mattered more than I understood then. Not because blame would save us. Because truth without responsibility is just another costume. I asked, what name? He blinked. What? In the journal. There were pages where you crossed one out. Then you wrote Nora. He inhaled so sharply I saw his shoulders move under the coat. I've been trying it with Mara. And with Dr. Larkin. A pause. Only if it feels right to you. I know that might be too much. That sentence, too much, almost undid me because it carried such old knowledge of me. Of my threshold. My caution. My need to walk around new feelings like they might bite. Even in the middle of telling me he might not be my husband in the way I had always believed, he was still measuring the disclosure against my comfort. Tenderness can make you furious when you want clean edges. I looked at him, I looked at Nora, though I could not think that yet without my stomach dropping, and noticed suddenly how exhausted he seemed. Not theatrical, not newly fragile. The deep exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a hidden language in their mouth for years, pressing it against their teeth so it won't escape. What happens now? I asked. He gave the only honest answer available. I don't know. A ridiculous wave of rage went through me. That's convenient. I know. He closed his eyes for a second. I know it is. I stood up and paced the 2 steps our kitchen allowed for pacing. Back to the fridge. Back to the table. The tile was cold under my feet. My hands smelled faintly of onion and dish soap. All the details of the room were offensively normal. The chipped bowl with clementines. The grocery list held by a magnet shaped like a pear. The sweater I had draped over my chair. I wanted the room to reflect the fact that the ground had moved. Instead, it kept being a room. He said, very softly, I can go to Mara's tonight. I stopped. Do you want to? No, he did not dress the answer up. But maybe wanting is not the most important thing right now. There it was again, his instinct to disappear and call it care. And because I knew him, because even then I knew him, I recognized how quickly I could let that happen and call myself principled. I don't want you to leave as a punishment, I said. No. But I can't do normal tonight. I know. And I don't know how to look at you. That finally made his composure slip. Not outwardly much. A tremor in the mouth. Moisture gathering at the rim of one eye. I know. He went to the bedroom and packed a small bag. Toothbrush. Charger. A folded cardigan from the tote bag, which told me he had intended, at some point, to bring that part of himself into our home by the front door and not the closet floor. I stood in the kitchen and listened to drawers open and close. When he returned, he had removed the pearl stud from one ear and was holding it in his palm like evidence. I forgot, he said. I'm sorry. This time the apology made me want to cry. Not for the earring. For the reflex of apology itself, how it had become his native language. Keep it, I said. He nodded. Put it back in. Picked up his bag. At the door he turned. I don't expect instant understanding. You won't get it, I said. A sad half-smile. That sounds fair. After the lock clicked behind him, the apartment changed temperature. I don't know if it actually got colder or if absence has its own weather. I stood there until the kettle cooled completely. Then I sat at the table and cried with so little drama it almost felt administrative. Tears. Tissues. Breathing. The body continuing to perform its duties while the mind lags behind. The next morning I made the stupidest mistake of the entire process. I called my mother. If you have ever been raised by a competent woman during a crisis, you know the seduction of it. Competence can feel like love when you are drowning. I told myself I needed practical support. I told myself I needed someone to sit with me while the ceiling repairman came. I told myself many things that were not the truth, which was this: I wanted to hand part of the fear to somebody older and stronger and let them call it by a name. My mother arrived within 40 minutes carrying coffee, a bag of bagels, and the expression she reserves for hospital corridors and airport delays. I should have stopped speaking after the first sentence. I did not. I told her enough. Not everything. But enough. She listened without interrupting, which should have warned me. Then she took a slow sip of coffee and said, well. That one syllable carried so much judgment it needed luggage. Don't, I said immediately. I haven't said anything. You have a whole paragraph on your face. She set down the cup. I am trying to choose my words. Please choose them better than the first ones. My mother looked toward the hall closet where the repairman had left a tarp. I think, she said carefully, and careful for her still had edges, that a marriage cannot survive if one person decides to become unrecognizable to the other. It is possible to be wounded and still hear cruelty clearly. I heard it. I also heard fear underneath it, because my mother had spent a lifetime believing stability was the only barrier between a woman and ruin. Anything that threatened categories threatened shelter itself. He didn't decide this yesterday, I said. No, apparently he decided to hide it for years. That part is true. And you think that doesn't matter? I didn't say that. She leaned back, arms crossed. Then what are you saying? I looked at the steam rising from the coffee and understood, with the slow terrible clarity of an adult seeing childhood from the other end, that my mother had given me many tools, but not this one. She knew how to survive abandonment, betrayal, money shortages, illness, public embarrassment, men who shrank from responsibility. She did not know how to stand in ambiguity without trying to hammer it flat. I'm saying, I answered, that if you make this simple, I will stop telling you things. That reached her. She inhaled, looked away, unwrapped a lemon candy and did not eat it. I'm worried about you. I know. I don't want you talked into tolerating something that destroys you. I know. She nodded once. And I don't know how to help if the categories are moving. For the first time that morning, she sounded more frightened than harsh. It softened me by exactly 1 inch, which was all I had available. You can help, I said, by not making me choose your reaction before I've found my own. She looked at me for a long time. That sounds exhausting. I almost smiled. You should try being me. After she left, I regretted the call immediately. Not because my mother had been entirely wrong. Secrecy had damaged us. My hurt was real. But because I had handed a fragile truth to someone who could only hold it with hard fingers. It would take months to undo the reach of that decision. It is one of the regrets I keep honestly. I betrayed Nora's timing the way Nora had betrayed my trust. Different reasons. Same wound pattern. Pain does not automatically make us wise, sometimes it just makes us contagious. For the next week, Nora stayed with Mara. Saying the name silently in my own head felt like stepping onto ice and discovering it held. Barely. Enough for 1 foot. Not both. We texted at first because text lets you ration a truth into units small enough to swallow. Are you eating? Yes. The cat got upstairs again. She has leadership qualities. I'll pay the electric bill today. Thank you. I need a day before we talk in person. Okay. On the 3rd day, Nora sent one message that sat on my screen for a full minute before I opened it. I am not asking you to protect me from the consequences of my dishonesty. I just want to answer your questions without defending my existence while I do it. I read that until the letters blurred. It was one of the most precise sentences anyone had ever sent me. It made room for my hurt without placing her identity on trial as payment. There are people who spend years in therapy and never learn how to ask for that distinction. I answered, meet me Saturday. The bakery cafe downstairs. 10. Saturday morning I almost canceled twice. Instead, I stood in front of my closet for 15 ridiculous minutes because apparently facing the possible redefinition of my marriage still left enough mental space for me to resent every sweater I owned. I chose navy. Sensible. Non-committal. If emotional cowardice had a textile, it would be navy merino wool. Nora was already there when I came down, sitting in the back corner with a mug between both hands. Mara's cobalt travel cup sat on the floor by the chair, which meant Mara had driven her and was performing support from a dignified distance. Nora wore jeans, low black boots, and a plain cream sweater. No coat this time. No dramatic entrance. Hair tucked behind one ear. The pearl stud was gone. In its place was nothing, which for some reason moved me more than if she had arrived fully arranged. She looked like someone trying not to frighten me with her own honesty. I sat down. The bakery's espresso machine hissed. A child dropped a spoon. Cinnamon hung in the air. I'm sorry, Nora said before I could order my thoughts. I held up a hand. I know you are. But don't start by trying to clean my feelings before I've put them on the table. A flicker of surprise, then a nod. Okay. That was one of the first small shifts between us. Before, Evan would have rushed to make the room easier. Nora, terrified though she clearly was, let me make it difficult. I asked practical questions first because practical is where I go when I'm bleeding. How long had the therapy been going on? 4 months. The support group? 6 weeks. Had there been anyone else romantically? No. Ever? No. Was the money from our account used for therapy, clothes, salon appointments? Yes, and she would reimburse every penny if I wanted. Had she told work? Not yet. Did she know whether she wanted hormones, a legal name change, a social transition? She didn't know everything. She knew enough to stop pretending none of it existed. Then I asked the question underneath all the others. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Nora looked down at the mug. Because I loved the life we had, and I was afraid any honest sentence would set fire to it. It still might. I know. Then why now? She took a breath. Because I realized I had turned protecting you into a very polished excuse for disappearing. And because the more I hid, the more I started resenting you for not seeing what I was actively concealing. That wasn't fair. It was making me smaller and meaner in ways you didn't deserve. I didn't want to become a person who punished you for my silence. That answer broke something open in me, not neatly, not beautifully. Just enough for truth to start moving where certainty had been. I said, you did punish me. Her eyes lifted. I know. With omission. With making me question my own instincts. I know. And I need you to keep knowing that, even when I'm trying to understand the rest. She nodded. I will. We sat with that. Around us, people ordered croissants and argued about milk alternatives and lived inside the comforting illusion that other people's tables were simple. Then Nora said, "Can I ask you something?" I almost laughed. That feels unfairly democratic, but yes. A tiny smile. The first one I had seen that reached her eyes since the night in the kitchen. When you saw me at the door, what did you feel first? Honesty arrived before diplomacy. Fear. She flinched, but not away. Of me? I thought about it. The smell of rain. The coat. The pearl stud. My own pulse in my throat. Not exactly, I said. Of losing the shape of my life so fast I couldn't get my hands around it. She nodded. That makes sense. And then, I added, surprising myself, I felt stupid for not understanding what I was already looking at. You weren't stupid. No. But I was attached to being right about who we were. Nora's mouth tilted. You do enjoy a labeled container. I stared at her for 1 second and then, against all internal policy, I laughed. It came out snorted and graceless and real. She laughed too, quietly, and the sound was so painfully familiar that I had to look down into my coffee. Humor, I learned, did not betray the seriousness of what was happening. Sometimes it was the only thing keeping it from swallowing us whole. I started seeing a therapist 2 weeks later because Danny, who had listened without flinching to the increasingly impossible architecture of my thoughts, finally said, you can keep trying to out-organize a grief that has teeth, or you can get professional help. I support either, but only one comes with someone trained not to let you build a filing system around your panic. Dr. Feldman had a tiny cactus on her windowsill and the unnerving habit of waiting 3 beats longer than was comfortable after I spoke. In our second session, when I tried to explain the situation as if I were presenting quarterly losses, she interrupted me and said, what do you know, what do you fear, and what have you not yet asked? It irritated me because it was useful. So I made columns in a notebook. What I knew, Nora had hidden a central part of herself for years. Nora loved me. Nora had lied. Nora was trying, imperfectly, to stop. What I feared, that staying would make me disappear, that leaving would make me cruel, that everyone would reduce our life to gossip, that my mother would say I told you so with her entire body. What I had not asked, whether I could love a person whose gender shifted the story I had told about my own life, whether my grief meant rejection or simply loss of certainty, whether a marriage had to remain the same thing to remain real. Writing the questions down changed them. Not into answers. Just into objects I could carry instead of whether I had to stand in. Meanwhile, actual life insisted on continuing. The ceiling got repaired. Bills arrived. My father slipped on wet leaves outside the hardware store and bruised his hip badly enough to need help at home for a week. My mother, who could command logistics but had never learned to pace herself, exhausted herself in 2 days and accepted assistance from me with the facial expression of a woman swallowing a small nail. On the 3rd day I was at their house trying to open a jar for my father. He claimed the lid was defective. I claimed age had humbled him when the front door opened and Nora walked in carrying a grocery bag. I had not known she was coming. Neither had my mother. There are moments in a family when every old habit reports for duty at once. My mother straightened. My father lowered his newspaper exactly 3 inches. I froze with a tea towel in one hand and a jar in the other like some domestic statue dedicated to poor planning. Nora had dressed simply again, dark trousers and a rust-colored sweater, no makeup that I could see, hair tucked back. She looked first at me, then at my father, then at my mother, and said, with a steadiness I admired because I knew what it cost, "Mara told me Neil likes the soup from Klein's Deli better than anything anybody cooks with love." I brought 2 containers. My father, who had spent his life being emotionally quieter than weathered wood, blinked once and said, "Did you get the matzo ball?" "Yes." "Then come in before it gets cold." That was all. Not a speech. Not enlightenment. Just soup and an old man unwilling to waste it on ideology. My mother made a sound in her throat that could have meant 6 different things. Nora set the bag down and asked my father how the hip was feeling. He launched into a detailed complaint about the incompetence of sidewalk maintenance, and in 5 minutes they were discussing local government like nothing larger stood in the room at all. Later, when I walked Nora to the car, the air sharp with late autumn and chimney smoke, I said, "That was brave." She smiled without humor. "Apparently, I'm getting a reputation for it." I leaned against the porch rail. "My father liked you before he understood you. That may be his best quality. And his worst? He thinks silence counts as diplomacy." That sounds familiar. There it was again, the impossible tenderness of being known during upheaval. I looked at her. Really looked. Not at the category. At the person who had brought my father the right soup without being asked, who had crossed town to help the family of the woman she had wounded, who had once sewn my coat lining by hand while humming under her breath because she knew I'd be annoyed if it went to a tailor for such a simple repair. "I'm still angry," I said. "I know. And I'm still grieving. I think. Even though you're not dead, which feels rude to admit." Nora nodded. "I'm grieving too. For what I made necessary. For what you lost without choosing it." That was the first time our grief sat at the same table without competing for a chair. Not everything moved upward from there. Some days were bad in stupid ways. I misgendered her in front of a waiter and then over-apologized so badly I made us both want to crawl under the table. She told me she was considering using Nora at work and I spent an entire evening snapping at cabinet doors because the scale of it frightened me. My mother referred to her, once, as your husband with emphasis sharp enough to cut glass, and I said, more clearly than I had ever spoken to my mother in my life, "If you want access to me, you will not use my pain as permission to be cruel." My mother stared at me, then at my mother stared at me, then at Nora, who had gone still enough to look almost careful around her own breathing. The dish towel in her hand twisted once and stopped. Something passed over my mother's face then, not softness exactly, but arithmetic. The calculation of what being right might cost her. She looked back at me. "I don't understand this." "For once," I said, and my voice surprised even me by how steady it sounded, "understanding is not the first thing I need from you." My father, from his chair, cleared his throat in that dry, sandpaper way that usually meant he was about to say something either useless or accidentally profound. "Celia," he murmured, eyes still on the newspaper he wasn't reading, "you don't have to understand the weather to know when to bring someone a coat." My mother turned toward him with the expression of a woman married too long to be shocked by being corrected, but not long enough to enjoy it. Then she looked at Nora again. "I don't know what to call any of this," she said. Nora answered before I could. "You don't have to solve it today." That was one of Nora's gifts. When she was frightened, she could make room for other people's clumsiness without pretending it didn't scrape. It had probably also been one of the things that let her hide for so long. A strength and a flaw, stitched from the same thread. My mother set her mouth in a line I knew well. "I can try not to make it worse." It was not a warm sentence. It was not the sentence some generous scriptwriter would have given her. But it was honest, and honesty was suddenly worth more to me than performance. "Then start there," I said. Later, driving home alone with the windows fogging at every red light, I understood that was the first time in my adult life I had defended something before I could fully explain it. Not because I had arrived at perfect peace. I hadn't. I was still angry. Still bruised. Still waking at 3 in the morning with questions lined up like chairs in a waiting room. But the shape of my anger had changed. It was no longer asking, "How dare this happen to me?" It had begun, reluctantly, to ask, "What does care look like now that the old script is gone?" That question took months. Nora did not move back in right away. We saw each other 3, sometimes 4 times a week, in formats so structured they would have made my old self proud. Coffee on Saturdays. A walk on Wednesdays. Therapy every other Tuesday with a couples counselor named Imani who wore enormous silver earrings and had a voice calm enough to make Panic feel slightly embarrassed. She kept peppermint tea in her office and never let either of us get away with vague language. On our second visit she said, "You're both describing loss, but not the same loss. Say them accurately." I went first because I always do when a task is put on the table. "I lost the sense that I knew my own marriage," I said. "I lost trust in the timeline. I lost the version of my future that matched the life I thought I had chosen." Nora sat with that and didn't argue. Then she said, "I lost years to fear. I lost honesty with the person I love most. And I may lose this marriage because I waited so long to stop hiding." Imani nodded. "Good. Now neither of you gets to pretend only one person is grieving." It was harsh enough to be useful. There are people who think acceptance arrives like a curtain lifting, one graceful motion and suddenly the room makes sense. That was not my experience. Mine came in uneven little pieces, usually when I was too tired to defend myself against them. The first time I changed Nora's name in my phone, I stared at the screen for a full minute before pressing save, as if a contact entry were a binding legal statement instead of a tiny act of accuracy. The first time I used she without stumbling, I did it by accident while telling Danny a story about the cat and then stopped mid-sentence, startled by my own mouth. Danny just nodded and said, "Well, look at your brain catching up. Don't make a ceremony out of it." I'd never. I'm allergic to sincerity before noon. She was sitting cross-legged on my sofa in an old band t-shirt, peeling the label off a beer with the concentration of a surgeon. Danny had become my emergency landing strip through all of this. She was judgmental in entertaining directions and loyal in quiet ones. When I spiraled, she asked whether I wanted comfort, perspective, or carbohydrates. I once answered all 3, and she showed up with fries and a list. "Can I tell you something rude?" she asked that night. "You usually do. I think part of what's hurting you is not just that Nora hid. It's that you built a very elegant identity around being the woman whose life made sense." I turned to stare at her. "That is rude." "Thank you." It was also, annoyingly, true. I had loved Nora, yes. I had loved her patience, her careful hands, the way she noticed the cashier with the husband in chemo, the silver thimble in the leather pouch, the bruised flowers brought home because they were still worth arranging. But I had also loved what being married to Evan had allowed me to believe about myself. That I had chosen correctly. That I was safe from chaos because I had been smart enough, practical enough, disciplined enough. Her transition did not just threaten my image of her. It cracked my religion of predictability right down the center. Once I understood that, I felt ashamed for about a day and then, more usefully, curious. I asked Nora, on one of our long walks along the river while the wind shoved at our coats, "Do you think I loved you, or just the structure around you?" She tucked her hands deeper into her pockets. "I think you loved me through the structure that was available. I don't think that makes the love fake." That sounds suspiciously compassionate. "I've been in therapy. It's ruining my talent for bitterness." I laughed. Then I said, "I'm serious." "So am I." She glanced at me. "I think you loved a real person and attached that person to a role that made your world coherent. I helped build that role. On purpose. We were both living in it. That stayed with me because it refused easy innocence. I was not to blame for her secrecy. But neither was I entirely untouched by the comfort of the arrangement. We had both been rewarded by the version of our marriage that looked easy from the outside. We just had not paid the same cost for it. A month after the night in the kitchen, I asked Nora to tell me exactly what had happened before she came through the door. Not the years before. Just that day. I needed the final fragments assembled. We were in the apartment then, at the table where the first conversation had happened. She was back for dinner, not back for good, and the caution of that distinction sat between our plates. The kettle steamed lightly. Rain tapped the window as if the weather were incapable of fresh material. Nora rested both hands around her mug. "I had therapy at 4, she said. Dr. Larkin knew I was planning to tell you that night. I'd been saying I would for weeks." She asked what I was afraid of, and I gave her about 8 answers, all of them rehearsed. Then she said, "Which fear are you protecting the most, losing your wife, or losing the version of yourself that can still avoid this conversation?" I closed my eyes briefly. Therapists really do have no hobbies. That made her smile. Apparently not. After the session, I almost came straight home. Instead, I got on the train and went across town. I walked around for 40 minutes. I bought the lipstick because it was easier than buying courage. Then I went to Marigold because I had an appointment I'd booked 3 weeks earlier and nearly cancelled 3 times. When I got out, I listened to a voicemail from Dr. Larkin checking in. "That's the one you saw." I thought, if I don't do it tonight, I'm going to spend another month pretending Thursday means paperwork. She looked down into the tea. I stood outside the building for a full 2 minutes. I almost turned around when I saw the kitchen light on. Then I thought about the journal in the closet and the bag and the receipts and how pathetic it all was, this whole second life hidden behind the vacuum cleaner. And I came upstairs. I remembered the wet coat. The pearl stud. The shopping bag in her hand. What was in the bag? She blinked, then laughed under her breath. Flat shoes. I'd bought them because the boots were hurting my feet. The sound I made then was half laugh, half sob. It was so ordinary I could barely stand it. All that dread, all that history, and somewhere inside the center of it had been sore feet. That helps, I admitted. What part? The part where human beings remain embarrassingly practical even when their lives are on fire. She nodded. I was extremely on fire and very uncomfortable. After that, the hook in my own memory changed. The night she walked through the door stopped being only the night I didn't recognize my husband. It became the night Nora came home wearing fear and rain and a bad pair of boots, and I put a second mug on the table before I knew what I was making room for. Not because I was noble. Not because I understood. Because somewhere under the shock, my body knew the difference between punishment and listening. That second mug became a kind of private measuring stick for me. On the bad days, and there were bad days, I asked myself whether I was still willing to set it down. Bad days did not look cinematic. They looked like me standing in the pharmacy aisle, staring at razors and face wash and suddenly grieving every simple category I used to move through without thought. They looked like Nora telling me her office wanted to know what name to put on her email signature and me needing 10 quiet minutes in the bathroom before I could answer kindly. They looked like a wedding photo album I pulled from the shelf one Sunday afternoon, fully convinced I was mature enough for it, then crying onto the page where we were cutting cake because I missed the certainty on my own face. Once, I said something cruel out of exhaustion. We were assembling a cheap bookshelf because life is always at its most humiliating when tiny Allen keys are involved, and Nora kept apologizing each time we mismatched a screw. Finally I snapped, "Can you please stop saying sorry every time you breathe? I can't keep reassuring you that oxygen is allowed." The silence after that was instant and terrible. Nora set down the screw between two fingers as carefully as if it might explode. "You're right," she said. That made it worse, of course. "No," I said, rubbing both hands over my face. "I mean, maybe I'm right, but I said it like a jerk." "You're tired. So are you. That's not a moral exemption." She looked at the half-built shelf, then at me. It's hard to know which apologies are habit and which ones are still owed. That sentence settled into me with painful accuracy. "Both," I said. "Some of them are still owed. But some of them are just the shape you learn to survive in." Nora nodded. "I'm trying to tell the difference." "I know. And I did." That was the thing changing most reliably between us. Not the absence of pain. The presence of effort I could actually see. Winter arrived properly. The bakery windows fogged white every morning. The stray tabby bullied her way into our stairwell and then our apartment and finally our lives, at which point Nora announced, with more confidence than she had shown in most other areas, her name is Minister. Why? Because she looks like she disapproves of everyone equally. That, too, was true. Minister accepted exactly one form of affection and administered it like a permit. The cat became, against my better judgment, a bridge. Animals are efficient that way. Nora would come by to feed her when I worked late. I would text updates about the state of the litter box as if discussing municipal infrastructure. Small domestic things began sneaking back between us before larger ones felt settled. It mattered. Around New Year's, Nora moved back in. Not into some glowing cinematic reconciliation. Into the apartment. Into the same old building above the bakery. Into a life now crowded with new language and old grief and a cat who believed all doorways existed for dramatic pauses. We moved carefully. She took the side of the closet that used to hold my winter coats. We packed away some of Evan's old shirts, not as a funeral, not as denial, just as an acknowledgement that fabric can stop being accurate. She kept the silver thimble in the same leather pouch. That, for some reason, nearly made me cry. There are traits deeper than presentation, and I had been learning how to see them without treating them as proof of a category they had never promised to uphold. The first night she slept back in our bed, we lay side by side in the dark with about 6 inches of caution between us. "This is weird," I whispered. Exceptionally, Nora whispered back. After a pause, I said, "Minister has adjusted faster than we have. She has no ideals. It's a gift." I laughed into the pillow. Then the room went quiet again, not hostile, just alert. "Nora? I still don't know what this makes me." She was silent long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she said, "I don't either. I don't think you owe anybody a rush definition just because my truth altered the vocabulary around us." That answer was kinder than the ones I'd been giving myself. I had been secretly auditing my own identity, as if some external board might revoke my membership in womanhood or marriage or ordinary life if I failed to file the correct paperwork. But living with reality is not the same as submitting to a category on demand. Some things need to be carried before they can be named. Spring began like a rumor. The bakery started selling hot cross buns. The church bells were still late. My father's hip healed. My mother, in the way of mothers who do not apologize fluently, began trying through logistics. She asked whether Nora had any dietary restrictions now, which was absurd and probably sincere. Then, one Sunday, she handed Nora a cup of tea and said, a little stiffly, "Sugar?" Nora answered, "One, please." My mother put in 1 sugar cube and, without quite looking at her, asked, "And Nora is still right?" It was not graceful. It was not wrapped in insight. It was, however, a question asked directly, and in my family that can amount to an act of mountain moving. "Yes," Nora said. My mother nodded. "All right." Later, while drying plates, she said to me in a low voice, "I'm not proud of how quickly fear takes over my manners." I nearly dropped the dish towel. "That's the closest thing to an apology you've ever produced." She gave me a flat look. "Don't get greedy." I smiled despite myself. Some people change in floods. Others in teaspoons. A few weeks after that, I found the old Marigold Studio receipts in the drawer where I had put them away and forgotten them. The first evidence. The little paper ghosts of the life I hadn't known how to name. I held them for a long time, then walked them to the trash. Not because the past was resolved. Because it no longer needed to run the house. By summer, Nora was using her name at work. There were awkward emails, a few clumsy coworkers, one man in accounting who managed supportive language with the tone of someone carrying an unstable box, but the sky did not crack open. The property firm continued processing invoices and complaining about toner. Reality, once again, insisted on being less theatrical than fear. Nora came home after the first full week under her own name, stood in the doorway with her bag on her shoulder, and smiled in this tired, astonished way I knew immediately. "Well?" I asked. She set the bag down. "It turns out I still hate meetings." I laughed so hard I had to lean on the counter. That was the evening I understood the answer to the question that had haunted me for months. Had I loved the person, or the version of her I believed in? The answer was not neat, which is how I knew it was true. I had loved a real person through a false frame. I had loved traits that were genuine: kindness, steadiness, humor, attention, care, and I had woven them into a story about manhood and marriage that felt safe to me. When the frame broke, I mistook the breaking for total loss. It wasn't. But it was still a loss. Both things could live together without canceling each other. That became the most adult lesson of my life: grief and recognition can share a body. So can anger and loyalty. So can acceptance and uncertainty. The world kept trying to force me into cleaner sentences than the truth would allow, and the truth kept refusing. There are still moments when the old reflex rises. A form at a doctor's office. A stranger saying "ladies," and me feeling the tiny, delayed jolt of yes, that includes us now. A photograph surfacing in a drawer. A relative using the wrong name and then glancing at me as if I am the appointed translator of everyone's conscience. Some losses do not vanish, they become familiar enough to sit in the corner without running the conversation. And yes, there are still questions we haven't solved. What our marriage is called from the outside. Whether we will renew vows one day or leave the old ones as a document of who we were then. Whether love can survive being retranslated over and over. I don't know. I have finally made some peace with not knowing on schedule. What I do know is quieter. I know Nora still carries the silver thimble. I know she smooths napkins when anxious, though less often now. I know she cries more easily than Evan ever let himself and laughs more freely too. I know my mother keeps lemon candies in every coat pocket and now asks, before family dinners, "Will Nora be coming?" in a tone that tries not to make the effort visible. I know Danny still believes most crises can be improved by fries. I know Minister the cat answers to no one and sleeps between us like a tiny tyrant in a fur coat. I know my life is less tidy than it was, and also more honest. And I know this, on some rainy evenings, when the lock turns and Nora comes through the door smelling of wet wool and city air, I look up from the stove and recognize her completely. Not because the fear never happened. Not because the shock was imaginary. But because recognition, I learned, is not the same thing as familiarity with a role. It is the deeper thing. The pattern of care. The particular soul inside the body. The person who still brings home bruised flowers and arranges them beautifully. The person who once hid whole pages from me and then, at terrible cost, began handing them over one by one. The person I nearly lost because I thought certainty and love were the same thing. They aren't. Sometimes I still set out 2 mugs before she gets home. Tea for me. Tea for Nora. Steam rising in the yellow kitchen light. Nothing dramatic. No soundtrack. Just the daily choice, repeated enough times that it becomes a life. And that, more than the shock, is the part one carry now. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If something here touched something in you, a memory, a question, a feeling you couldn't name before, then this story did exactly what it was meant to do. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.